a nationalist, okay? I'm a nationalist.
Hi guys, welcome to the channel. This is my take. Somebody told me to lose the shades. Anyway, if you're new, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for further content. For those of you who don't know, this video is part 2 of a 4-part video series on liberal nationalism and how to defeat the populist right. If you haven't seen the last video where we covered the basics, I explained what populism is, why it's a problem, what its root causes are, and why responses so far by the mainstream have failed. So if you haven't seen that, click on the link in the description. In this video, we're going to cover what liberal nationalism is, why it's not an oxymoron, where it fits in with other nationalisms, and why we even need it. As I discussed earlier, the center ground cannot abandon patriotism or national identity because it is questions of identity and national belonging fueled by demographic change that are producing the cultural insecurity that is driving right-wing nationalist populism. In part 3, I'm going to look at the empirical evidence to show why I believe that liberal nationalism can work, and in part 4, I'm going to look at some of the practical ways that it can be implemented. Anyway, let's get down to it. Alright, so before we dive into what liberal nationalism is, I wanted to clear up something. I know a lot of you are already thinking, isn't nationalism bad? And if you look at the 20th century and you see the Yugoslavia wars or Hitler, that would make a lot of sense. But people like Gandhi, Julius Nyerere, or even the Scottish SNP are also nationalists, and they're not bad. So in other words, there is a good and a bad kind of nationalism, and I wanted to lay out the 2 caveats that make the distinction. Number 1, a nationalism that entails a sense of superiority over other nations and that therefore a nation can pursue its own interest at the expense of other nations, that's bad. And that's what Hitler used to justify invading other countries. Secondly, a nationalism that is exclusivist in its conception of the nation by defining national membership along ascriptive rather than elective characteristics. Now, ascriptive characteristics are unchangeable, while elective characteristics can be adopted by anyone. So a nationalism that is defined along ethnic, racial, or religious lines is ascriptive. And what makes this bad is that these are not traits that newcomers or minorities can easily adopt. And so they immediately become a problem for the nation, which necessarily leads to discrimination against those minorities. So for any nationalism to be liberal, it must avoid doing those 2 things. Alright, so what is liberal nationalism? Now, traditionally, scholars have placed nationalism on a spectrum, with civic nationalism on the one end and ethnic nationalism on the other, and maybe cultural nationalism somewhere in the middle. Now, civic nationalism is basically an inclusive, thin, values-based nationalism based on the Constitution and such civic elements like citizenship, political ideology, national territory, and political institutions and rights. Cultural nationalism is thicker and encompasses such cultural factors as language, traditions, religion, and history, while ethnic nationalism is exclusivist and includes ethnicity and race. And if you look at what kind of policies might flow from each kind of nationalism, pure civic nationalism would not necessarily promote the majority culture. Perhaps they would even promote minority cultures in the name of multiculturalism. It would not support assimilationist policies, and it would have a very open immigration policy. Cultural nationalism would promote the dominant national culture, encourage assimilation, and have a conditional immigration policy, whereas pure ethno-nationalism would solely promote the ethnic majority culture, not encourage assimilation in the belief that minorities could never assimilate, and have a very restrictive immigration policy favoring only people of the same ethnicity. Now, given that liberal nationalism is meant to go beyond a thin, values-based nationalism, but remain liberal at the same time, I'll conceptualize liberal nationalism as combining civic components with some cultural components. The commitment to liberal values and a creedal conception of the nation is what makes it liberal, while a commitment to a national culture makes it national, placing it somewhere in the middle of the spectrum between pure values-based civic nationalism and an exclusivist ethnic nationalism. So liberal nationalism would include strong patriotism, strong respect for liberal democracy, including minority rights, freedom of religion, and equality before the law. It would be creedal and values-based, rejecting ethnic conceptions of the nation, but it would necessarily include national culture. Now, what is this national culture? The way to think about this would be similar to that expressed by Fukuyama when he described Huntington's view of the American nation. America was originally founded by Anglo-Saxon Protestants, some of whom believed that America ought to be based not only on common values, the Constitution or civic nationalism, or even a common language, English, but also common religion, Protestantism, and a common ethnicity, Anglo-Saxon. This would be an ethnic conception of the nation, and struggles in American history have whittled down the national identity to just two civic-based components, a common language and common values. Now, Huntington argues that the success of the US depends not just on a minimal values-based understanding of the nation, but also on certain cultural norms and virtues. America would not have been the same if it had been settled by Spanish or Portuguese rather than Anglos. America was built around the Protestant work ethic. This doesn't mean that only Anglo-Saxon Protestants should qualify as real Americans, that would be ethno-nationalism, but the culture brought by these people was critical for the future development of the country as it is today. Therefore, maintaining this culture rather than the ethnic groups associated with it is important. And so we can acknowledge and celebrate the historical roots of this culture while recognizing that it can be detached from its particular ethnic roots and embraced by all citizens, regardless of ethnicity. Therefore, liberal nationalism will continue to celebrate the cultural values, traditions, history, and language of the original ethnic group that founded the country, while remaining detached from these ethnic roots, allowing citizens of all ethnic backgrounds to take part. Now, this necessitates a more assimilationist policy when it comes to immigration, following is more of a sort of melting pot model rather than the kind of salad bowl multiculturalism where the government seeks to preserve the cultures of minority immigrant communities. Assimilation in this context means basically the decline in the importance of ethnic distinctions and boundaries and differences because of a multi-generational process of acculturation between groups, secularization of the immigrants, and intermarriage between groups. By the way, this doesn't necessarily refer to the disappearance of all ethnic markers, but most especially to the decline in their relevance. So, with liberal nationalism, individuals would be free to practice whichever religion, eat whichever food, or speak whichever language they choose in the private sphere, so long as these do not infringe on other people's rights. However, where the national culture itself is at stake, the state would be involved in the public sphere, where some cultural features such as language, art, history, or some tradition has become part of the national culture. The state is justified in promoting it. For instance, through the school curriculum or through cultural events or institutions. It is the national culture that gives a national society its distinct identity, and that's what forms the glue that binds citizens to each other and to the political project that is the liberal democratic state. Liberal nationalism is also flexible in that as minorities assimilate, some aspects of their culture may be absorbed into the national culture. You see this, for instance, with St. Patrick's Day in America, which is an Irish tradition, but is now celebrated by all Americans, not just Irish Americans. So guys, given that liberal nationalism emphasizes moving away from ethnic conceptions of the nation, why not just do civic nationalism? Well, I'll tell you why civic nationalism is not enough to provide an inclusive form of collective identity that can challenge nationalist populism. Essentially, civic nationalism is too thin, as it were. A nationalism based on universal principles like liberal democracy is not particularistic enough. It's great that people in the US believe in liberal democracy, but so do people in France and in Ireland, heck, even in Botswana. So a nationalism based simply on universal values cannot provide the sense of distinction and identity that people in a particular nation crave. And what you see is that even in allegedly civic nationalist countries like France or America, there is a historic majority. There is a dominant language used in the discourse. There are dominant cultural values that shape the terms of debate. In other words, a thin civic identity is located within a thick cultural identity. The heroes, holidays, and monuments that a society depends upon to foster a civic identity are necessarily rooted in a thicker particularistic culture. This thicker particularistic culture is the national culture promoted by liberal nationalism. It is this that creates the sense of belonging among citizens that attaches them to the more abstract and universalist political principles. Alright, so maybe you guys are thinking, that's all good and well, but isn't liberal nationalism torn apart by liberalism's emphasis on individual autonomy and universal values and nationalism's emphasis on collectivism? In other words, isn't liberal nationalism an oxymoron? Well, I assert that it is not. Classical liberals like Isaiah Berlin have this concept of negative liberty. Negative liberty describes freedom from external constraints, the freedom to act to the limits of your own capabilities. It's basically the freedom to be left alone. It's from this idea that we get such freedoms as freedom of religion or freedom from search without a warrant. Liberal nationalism will ensure that it remains liberal by respecting all citizens' negative liberty. The project of promoting collective attachment to a set of political principles through means of national culture can never go so far as to impose external constraints upon people that significantly limit their negative liberty. This is what distinguishes liberal nationalism from more authoritarian forms of cultural or ethnic nationalism. So for those of you who are concerned about the assimilation part of liberal nationalism, the cultural aspects of liberal nationalism must remain elective rather than ascriptive, so that they can be reasonably adopted by anyone who acculturates to these values. Forcing people to eat the same food, adopt certain naming practices, or convert to a certain religion oversteps the boundaries of liberalism by infringing upon the private realm of citizens' lives that should remain untouched by the state. There is an analytical difference between the state promoting a certain national language or national values through education and the media, and the state intervening in citizens' private lives. Liberal nationalism would restrict itself to the public sphere, promoting a sense of belonging to a nation with a common history and a common future in order to bind citizens to a political community and liberal democratic principles. It stops short, however, of promoting a single conception of the good for each citizen to live by, which is what makes liberal nationalism liberal. Insofar as this constraint is maintained, there need not be a tension between liberalism and nationalism. Now, for those of you who argue that this cultural aspect of liberal nationalism is not inclusive enough, one does not achieve this by discarding all aspects of national identity that bind citizens together, but rather by adapting the national identity to include aspects of minority cultures. Rather than abandoning the teaching of civics and national history in schools, it should be taught in such a way that gives due weight to the role these groups have played in making said national history. A national history focusing only on the atrocities in American history, from slavery to Jim Crow or the Indian Wars, may alienate majority whites. Similarly, a history glorifying westward expansion and the Confederacy may alienate minorities. But one can also tell a story that is both true and inclusive. One can tell a story of a nation founded by great but imperfect men, based on certain exceptional values. These values, rights, and freedoms were not enjoyed by all, but the American story is one of gradually extending those liberties to all Americans, a struggle that continues to this day, embracing the original values set in stone by the Founding Fathers. By venerating the Founding Fathers, Americans do not condone all their actions, but recognize their role in starting the multi-generational project that all Americans strive toward today. This is both pride in and recognition of the flaws of a country's history. A liberal nationalist approach should adopt this interpretation of the national story in order to be inclusive of minorities without attacking the identity and cultural symbols held dear by the ethnic majority. Similar national stories might be told in other Western countries by liberal nationalists. To conclude, we should not surrender the concept of nationalism to the populist right and its exclusionary and nativist elements. Rather than rejecting collective identity, we can harness it in such a way that it is open and democratic, being responsive to the concerns of populist voters without giving in to illiberal demands. Having addressed liberal concerns and demonstrated the need for civic ideas to be rooted in a thicker particularistic culture, why would this even attract populist voters? The next video will show empirical evidence that suggests that ethnic majority populations may indeed derive their national identities from those attributes included in liberal nationalism, and may even reduce their support for populist parties as a result. Stay tuned, watch, like, and subscribe, because this was my take.